94. Oh, we're
Right.
live. Hello and welcome, everybody. It's always such fun when I get the chance to chat to our amazing experts backstage offline, and sometimes I get caught mid-sentence. But yes, so as you can see, we have none other than Dr. Robert Cywes with us today on this portentous occasion, which is International Youth Day. And you may be wondering why, Dr. Robert Cywes, but hopefully you're not wondering at all, because most of you will know that although Dr. Rob Cywes is best known for being the CarbAddictionDoc and for his, bariatric surgery background, I'm sure many of you do know that he actually specializes in pediatrics. He's a pediatric general surgeon. Is this correct, Dr. Cywes?
That is correct. So that's my background is heavily involved with children, and it started out with the surgical care and now really morphed into the metabolic management of children, which is really the topic of today's discussion is how do we enhance the metabolic side of our kids? And I'll take my surgical hat off and put the psychologic and metabolic hat on.
Wonderful. Well, we're so incredibly lucky to be able to rack your brain on this International Youth Day edition of Nutrition Network's live videos, as well as our podcast and our YouTube channel, which is where all these things go to. If you miss it today, don't worry, you can catch it on YouTube or on our podcast. And as Dr. Cywes says, we're talking about growing a healthy brain today. And I think I'd just like to start, Dr. Cywes, with some stats, if that's okay. So I know that in your lecture, which is included both in the Nutrition Network ketogenic training, as well as in our Metabolism in the Mind training, which is also very closely aligned with your chapter on the same topic within the ketogenic textbook, you speak about neurodevelopment and neurodevelopmental disorders and metabolism and nutrition. And in that vein, it does appear that behavioral and neurodevelopmental disorders in the youth globally are on the rise. And in the United States in particular, the prevalence of autistic spectrum disorder, which is a neurodevelopmental condition, has increased from 1 in 150 children in 2000, and then all the way up to today, 1 in 30 children. So from 1 in 150 to 1 in 30 children today. Is this the kind of stat that you have, Dr. Cywes?
Yeah, and it's even worse than that, Tamzyn, if we go back just a little bit further. In 1970, in the 1970s, here in the US and in certain hotspots like South Korea, it was about 1 in 15,000. 1 in 15,000 children were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And it isn't because we've become better or the definition has changed. That is about the amount that we had, the number of kids with autistic spectrum disorder in the 1970s. Now here in the US, it's around 1 in 30, 1 in 32 kids. And there is no statistical ability to explain that on a genetic basis. And yet that is still what people trying to, they're desperately looking for that pearl that proves, that hidden pearl that proves that this is a genetic problem. And it classically isn't. And we have very, very obvious, right in front of us, evidence of what has actually changed. So what you've just given me is evidence from an epidemiologic study. We look at a change of it. This is what it was in 70, this is what it is now. But that doesn't explain why. And a large part of what we're going to discuss today is why do we think that has changed? And then I just want to throw one other thing out there. While autism spectrum disorder is a measurable structural change in the brain, although it's not diagnosed that way, there are a myriad of other, not so much neurodevelopmental, but neuropsychologic aberrations in our youth. We see a rise in ADHD, in anxiety. Something that we don't speak about, and there's a policy in the US not to report this in the media, is childhood suicide. And it's rampant. And it is a very, very sad state of affairs. And so we have to be all inclusive in terms of understanding how dysfunctional and how increasingly dysfunctional our young children are, facing enormous stresses and enormous external pressure competitively, and yet not being given the emotion management skills and tools to be able to navigate through this awfully stressful time. One final statistic: when I was born, there were 3.4 million people, 3.4 billion people on Earth. Now, within my lifetime, we're now over 8 billion people. That is a massive competition for our young kids to have to work against. And if they're not given the tools, that's very problematic.
Wow. So I think you've started touching on a few of the things that might be behind this increasing behavioral, neurological, psychological dysfunction in our youth. I'm just going to put my dogs out quickly. Okay. But while I do, please excuse me, could you maybe start diving in to what the potential factors could be behind this? You've mentioned like strategies, psychological strategies, but there's so many other things in the environment that have changed, Dr. Cywes. I mean, toxins, okay, stress, as you said, screens, what we eat, how much physical activity we do. What is it? All of these things, or is it one of these things? What is behind this?
Well, let's look at what you've described as a combination of what I call ants and elephants. There is an elephant in the room that we need to address. And then all these other things are important to address, but if without addressing the elephant in the room, the ants don't matter that much, if that makes sense. Or really focusing on the ant and ignoring the elephant doesn't help. So I want to break this down into two separate segments. The first thing to understand is that a child's emotion management skill set, the skills and the tools that we use that define us as human beings, to manage anxiety, stress, depression, anger, fear, frustration, boredom, pleasure, the insult of the world to us. We all have skills and tools that we use just to dissipate and manage that stress so that we can function. Those skills and tools are learned. They're learned within the first 2 to 5 years of our lives. And they are cast in stone in terms of the methodology. There's an instant gratification methodology where you get an instant massive release of endorphins that relaxes you, but because it's short-lived, precludes you from effectively processing issues. And then there's something called an effort-based strategy, where you have to put effort and time into your relaxation, but the reward is on the back end where you are emotionally relaxed, but you've given yourself time to process whatever the issues are, come up with a game plan, and an effort-based system is incredibly self-affirmatory. So it builds self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-respect in the children. Now, I've covered a lot of territory there, but let me give you an example. We always imagine the old days as being kumbaya wonderful, not necessarily so. But if you think about Africa and rural Africa, a mother would have a child. Let's say she was working either herding or gardening or doing something rurally. She would have that baby strapped to her back, and we still see that from time to time. There would be that close communication. She'd be singing or talking to the baby. And the only way to raise a child, the only way to raise a child is to be the person you want them to be. Children emulate our behavior. That's how they learn emotion management strategies. So if that mom is out there being physically active, she's talking to her friends, she's singing, the child is engaged. And they learn that skill set of calmness, of ways to be physically active, to relax you. And they learn that skill set. What do we do now? We're working, we're busy. The two things we do for our kids, we put them in front of a screen, which is instant gratification. And whether those screens are so-called educational, it's baby Einstein, it's irrelevant. What that kid is getting is autonomous instant gratification from a screen. It is not having human connection. And secondly, what we then do, so if I'm busy working, I put my kid in front of a screen and I give it some snacks. And whether that's, it's healthy snacks, it's apple slices, or it might just be a Go-Gurt or a yogurt that is full of sugar. So we give them sugary snacks as a drug to calm them down, instant gratification, and we put them in front of a screen that precludes them from developing. So they're watching somebody else live their lives. The ideal way to raise a child psychologically is with something called chess, creative arts, where you teach them to be and show them to be creative. You can be painting, it could be fashion, reading, photography, playing games, engaging with that child. The second one is human connection, which you lose in front of a screen. The third one is physical activity. If you're sedentary looking at a screen, you lose physical activity and play as an emotional off-ramp. The next one is spirituality and meditation. Meditation is not in front of a screen. There are relaxing times where a child is given autonomous time to play or just be quiet in his or her room. That meditative effect may be a spiritual component, and then healthy sleep. And when children are so busy watching screens, they don't want to go to sleep. That's problematic as well. Or they're high on sugar and they're running around like a balloon where you've just let it go up into the air and it's going all over the place. They don't have a sleep cycle that gives them that sleep, that rest, that activity. So chess, creative arts, human connection, exercise, spirituality, meditation, and healthy sleep, those are the ideal foundations. And very few people are raising their children with that conscious awareness. So that's the psychology behind it, which is a dramatic change, irrespective of the structure of your brain. But then secondly, the brain has to have a structure. And the human brain is the only mammalian brain that continues to develop structurally for the first 4 to 5 years of life after the child is born. So if you look at the brain, there's gray matter, which is where the thought processes happen. And then there is white matter, which connects the gray matter. So if you think about the old-fashioned telephone, you had the phone, somebody was talking into the phone, but there was a wire that connected it. And the human brain, the white matter, a little bit more than the gray matter, is primarily made of a substance called fat and a variety of fats. So it's the structural fats, 3 omega fatty acids, essential fatty acids, and 6 omega fatty acids, and cholesterol. Human brain's about 2 to 5% of our body. It requires and uses about 20% of our cholesterol, and it makes its own cholesterol. So if you look at fat in the human body, we are producing fat all the time. We are producing fat. Our liver is producing fat. Our fat cells are producing fat. But for the most part in the modern diet, which is very high in sugar and starch, the fat comes from the conversion of excess sugar to fat. And if you understand the story of the 3 little pigs who had the house of straw, the house of sticks, and the house of stones, when you build your brain and you use the fat that came from the conversion of sugar to fat, it is a 16-chain molecule. It is a very poor quality of fat. It is meant for energy. It isn't meant for structure. So if you're structuring your brain with that, it crumbles. It doesn't develop properly. If you eat fat and you eat fat that is longer chain, 18, 20 polyunsaturated or saturated fat molecules, those carbon structures are structural fat. The easiest way to look at it is if you look at crude oil, we turn crude oil into energy, gasoline or petrol that goes in the tank, and then there's oil that goes in the engine to lubricate it. 2 different energies, both coming from crude oil. Well, the brain is the same. And you want energy, which is ketones and fat, but you also want structural fat. And in an era where we've demonized fat in our diet, where we are not eating animal products, we're not consuming high levels of animal fat, but we're consuming high levels of sugar that the body turns to fat, the structure of the brain suffers. An autism spectrum disorder can be diagnosed on an MRI, a glimpse at the structure of the brain at 3 months of age. And it evolves and gets worse because the child is still developing their brain over 5 years. However, here's the mistake we've made. Autism spectrum disorder has no structural element to its diagnosis. It is diagnosed psychologically by certain criteria. So I'll give you an example. If you run a 100-meter race, there's a clock that tells you exactly how fast you went. But if you're in ice skating or gymnastics, you require someone's opinion of how well you did. And it's biased based on their own experience. So there's inherent bias, and the diagnosis depends on another human being, so-called expert, observing the child and deciding whether they have autism. So while we quoted 1 in 30, And it's a very emotionally sensitive issue with parents. It probably is even a lot higher when you get MRIs of the brain than when you get just a DSM-5 psychiatric diagnosis. So this is not just something that's happening, it's epidemic. And it's so simple to solve if you understand what is something called the proper human diet for a child. If you look at breast milk is very high in saturated fat. It's got some glucose and galactose in it, and it's got a decent amount of protein in it. If you look at the formulas we're giving to our babies, they're pretty much milkshakes. They're high in sugar. They don't have saturated fat. They've got a very poor quality polyunsaturated fat, usually soy fats. May be fine for energy for a little while, but absolutely devastating to the very rapid structural growth of that baby. And even if they're breastfed, now you're weaning them onto, in this country, Cheerios and Goldfish and candy and sweets and cereals. And there is no advantage to that child in terms of developing its brain structurally. So they have two disadvantages. They have a structural deficit, and on top of that, they're exposed to poor learning behavior of how to manage their emotional need. And that makes them dysfunctional in society. They cannot learn, they cannot compete, and it becomes a huge, huge challenge for that child who's probably going to live for another 80 to 90 years.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So I think I'm going to start in reverse because I think we went on to kind of the diet side of things and how that can impact the brain. But it sounds like this is happening already in utero. If they're born, you said 3 months of age already, you can pick up aberrations or abnormalities on an MRI. So that makes me think that it's not just 3 months of breastfeeding or lack of breastfeeding, let's say soy formula, that did it. There was something already in utero, surely.
You're absolutely correct. A great question. So the human brain begins to develop at about 6 weeks of age, 6 weeks of gestation, before many women even know they're pregnant. The interesting thing is the pancreas only develops around 15 to 16 weeks. The pancreas is where you produce insulin that regulates sugar and fat based on whether it's high or low. So there's this disparity, this block of time where the brain is structurally very rapidly developing in utero, where that child is, or the growing fetus is completely dependent on the mother's substrate provision, on the mother's blood sugar levels, the mother's fat levels. And the pancreas will produce a level of ketones that's about 3 times higher than the mother, which is a beautiful thing about human nature. However, one of the commonest diseases we see, and every gynecologist or obstetrician is looking for this, is gestational diabetes. Every pregnant mother now here in the US gets an oral glucose tolerance test. They get that looked at. There's several gynecologic practices here that put a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, on their pregnant mothers because they realize the impact of gestational diabetes, elevated blood sugar, insulin resistance, in both the mother's care and the quality of the fetus in the pregnancy. I'll give you an example. If a mother has gestational diabetes in the first trimester, there's a 17%, almost 1 in 5 fetal loss during the pregnancy. Those babies don't survive just in that gestational diabetes period. But if they do survive, the impact on brain development and on total body development is awful. These babies, especially in the last trimester, gain a lot of weight, but they don't gain muscle weight. So the classic, when Prof. Noakes, when I was in his physiology class, we knew that the baby of a diabetic mother was a big, and I'm going to use this word scientifically, not emotively, a big, fat, floppy baby. No muscles, floppy, poorly developed. And that's what these babies start with coming out of the womb. Plus, their brain has not developed adequately. So already there are structural changes to the brain. That's why at 3 months of age, you can pick that up on MRI. And the reason I said 3 months is because that's what the study showed. I'm certain that you can pick that up even if you did an MRI in utero. You could pick that structural change up in the baby's brain. So before the baby is born, it's the single most vital organ to a human being that defines us as humans. Our brain is already underdeveloped or poorly developed. And that is directly related to how the mother manages her emotional needs during pregnancy by consuming excessive amounts of sugar and starch that rapidly spike and keep insulin or blood sugar levels very high.
Wow. So I'm thinking that if gestational diabetes has such a huge impact, one can imagine that this kind of impact isn't binary. It's not like there's some magic blood glucose level threshold that you cross over and suddenly it's bad. There must be some kind of more of a continuum where there's already deleterious or negative effects that are happening to the fetus at lower blood glucose levels. Maybe there's a bit of insulin resistance. Maybe the body is compensating. I mean, obviously there's insulin resistance in pregnancy anyway, but maybe the body is compensating. You're not getting a clinically gestational diabetic mother, but you're seeing slight rises in blood glucose or rises in insulin beyond the norm. Or I imagine it's not just glucose. I imagine there's other nutrients that could also be playing a role that the mother may or may not be eating during pregnancy, which then could also be having an impact on the fetus.
Absolutely. And first of all, it is a spectrum, and that's why it is so difficult to diagnose. You can be, and there's a genetic component to how effectively the mother's body produces insulin, how it controls blood sugar. Some moms gain a lot of weight, others don't gain a lot of weight, but they become diabetic easily. That's related to insulin production and the ability to clear that blood sugar. So sugar and carbohydrates in the diet is an essential part, but typically and you're correct, when you are eating carbohydrates, the foods or the things that you eat that contain carbohydrates are very rarely accompanied by adequate micro and macronutrients and minerals, vitamins, trace elements that growing fetus and the mother require for optimal functioning. So plus also they're snacking on a regular basis, which prevents the normal cycle. The human body ideally goes through 3 cycles each day. A storage phase where you store the food you've eaten, a glucose utilization phase shortly after eating, and then a fat utilization phase. And it's in that fat utilization phase, a long time after you haven't eaten, where you are repairing, you're growing tissue, you're modifying tissue. And especially for that growing fetus, that block of time is the healthiest time. If you're snacking and eating all the time, that's problematic. And on top of that, if you hadn't eaten adequate nutrients, that's problematic as well. And I think one of the challenges for us is this massive, emotive, quasi-religious, industry-driven, I know those are huge, almost conspiracy theory words, but what's driven us as human beings backward toward a more plant-based eating pattern. The issue with modern-day plants, if you buy your plants from a commercial grocery store, certainly here in the US, not a single plant that you buy currently in the grocery store existed in its current form when I was born. So the hybridization, the transformation of the plants that we're eating has been rapid and horrific. It gives it a longer shelf life. It makes it bigger, and more full of sugar, but it has radically decreased the nutrients. So we're fertilizing all these plants that we're growing commercially. They're not getting healthy nutrients from the soil. So even if you are mostly plant-based, the quality of nutrition you get from that food is horrific. And then when we use manufactured food, I don't like the word processed food, but manufactured food, that is even more deficient. So for example, white flour, anything white, your white rice, it's devoid of the ideal nutrients that should be there. So the statement that I make is that the plants in our diet are primarily there for enjoyment, for latitude, for fun to eat, but they really don't offer adequate nutrient value. And as human beings, we cannot eat adequate nutrient value. There are only 4 things that we can consume that in and of themselves have the highest quality of micronutrients in the broader spectrum. So obviously most mothers, I'm going to put a 5th one in here for pregnant mothers, most mothers should be taking a prenatal vitamin. So that prenatal vitamin is a supplement that adds in some of the micronutrients, but not all of them. The 4 foods that offer comprehensive micronutrients, and if you're doing 2 of the 4 at pregnancy, you're probably getting adequate. Number 1, eggs, and these are all whole. Egg is a whole chicken except for the calcium. Dairy. Remember that dairy is the only substrate or only substance that is 100% complete in nutrition, and no mammal can survive without dairy. So dairy has everything in it in the right proportions. And obviously, if it's cow's milk or goat's milk, it's a little bit different, but at least it offers that baby all the nutrients processed by the mother, including the calcium. The third one are your small fish and your shellfish. So fish roes, sardines, oysters, clams, mussels. Human beings are shoreline evolutionary animals. So we have a very close relationship with marine products. And a lot of, for example, for brain structure, the 3 omega fatty acids are essential. We cannot produce them. We have to consume them. That comes from those marine animals. You can take a fish oil as a substrate or as a pill, but you're still getting that marine food in. And the smaller fish that are more complete, if you look at a sardine, it's got most elements in there as opposed to just the muscles of a fish. You're getting in the nutrients you need. An oyster, a clam, mussels, if you like that. And the final one is liver. Liver and some of the organs have the micronutrients in them that you need, that the fetus, the growing fetus needs for that metabolic state. So a lot of people are like, oh, that's disgusting. How can I eat that? That's fine. Every time you eat an egg, you're eating a whole chicken's liver. So if you think about it, because when that egg hatches, it's a chicken and it's got a liver. So if you are getting your nutrients from food, primarily on the animal side, the micronutrients are wonderful, as is the animal fat and the protein. The only place you can get all 21 amino acids from is from animal products. Plants do not offer the full spectrum of amino acids in one sitting. You got to go here, there, and everywhere to get adequate amino acids. And you cannot build healthy protein if you are deficient in certain essential proteins, and there are 9 essential proteins. So the essential fat, the essential proteins are the macros we need. The sugar we can develop for ourselves, that fetus can develop that for itself. The fetal liver will produce the sugar. So while you don't have to be carnivore, at least have a foundation of animal product in your diet, whether it's seafood, whether it is fowl, birds, whether it is pork, beef, lamb. It doesn't matter what the source of the animal is. Even just eggs, cheese are excellent sources of nutrients for that developing baby, and they protect the mother, plus they allow the hormonal fluctuation to happen. Now, a lot of people are going to say, oh, but that's too expensive, I can't afford it. I would argue that it is cheaper to get meat than to buy the amount of carbohydrates most pregnant mothers eat. Those bags of chips, those chocolates, those all that garbage that offers no nutrient value costs way more than having small amounts of meat or animal product. Doesn't have to be the highest quality.
Thank you. So I think that's exactly what I was going to ask, is the practical strategies. Can we apply the same rules, the same nutritional rules to the baby? Obviously, I was going to say once it's born, but let's say after 4 to 6 months, when you start weaning the baby onto foods beyond breast milk, can you apply that same kind of those foods, those quintessential foods? Can you apply them to the post 4 to 6 month old baby as well?
Absolutely. Let me just qualify. I'm going to come to that. Let me qualify one thing. I know I may sound a little evangelical and outside of the realm of what is possible for most people. I'm not saying don't eat your pap or your carbohydrates, but I am saying eat those other things as well. Don't exclude them. Try to create a foundation of animal product, and then you can add those other things. Carbohydrates are not a problem in our diet, but sometimes our relationship with them, when we use them as a drug instead of as a food, and we prioritize them and we deprioritize the other foods, that's where the problem occurs. So if you are able to sustain that full spectrum food, that is ideal. Some of us are not able to do that. And you've got to understand yourself and understand where you get trapped into excessive carbohydrates. So as a foundation, it doesn't take a lot of food. 1 or 2 eggs a day is not that expensive, but it gives you huge bang for buck. So once you start weaning, and as a pediatric surgeon, we can modify some of the recommendations of pediatricians. A healthy term baby can begin to eat real food at around 4 months. Whereas if you're a premature baby or if you have other health issues, we may want to wait to about 6 or 7 months before we begin to introduce food. The ideal is breast milk, but if you cannot get breast milk, do not feed the baby other animal milk, because the constituents, for example, of a newborn baby to drink cow's milk is going to be toxic to that baby. There's just too much of a difference. Probably the closest is goat milk. That is where we have to use formula, but you can buy better formulas for that baby in the first few months. And you want to, if you're breastfeeding, you want to continue to feed that baby as long as you can. The longer the baby or even the young child can sustain itself foundationally on breast milk, the better, even up to 18 months, 2 years. Now it's become socially unacceptable, or we're working, whatever it is. If you look at when I was growing up, that was the norm, to breastfeed babies until their teeth came in, and then it became unpleasant. So, and remember, breast milk is 100% carnivore. Breast milk is your quintessential carnivore food, animal food. Once you start to wean, babies are interested in fat and protein. They're not interested in carbohydrates until they develop an affinity for it. You know, the first time you smoke, it's horrible. But if you practice it enough, now you get hooked on smoking. That's what we do to our babies when we wean them onto cereals and carbohydrates. It is not the ideal baby food. Tastes very different than formula milk. So they dislike it to begin with, but pretty quickly they develop the addiction to it. And now the problem is they're demanding sugar and starch, and they won't eat the others. So I get lots of mothers, well, he or she won't eat meat. That is not a natural instinctive thing. That is a learned behavior. And a lot of the autistic kids have sensory issues. If you can take that textured meat early on, and whether they gum that piece of meat to death, like my son did, 4 months of age, I had a piece of ribeye steak in his mouth, and he gummed and sucked that thing until it was gray. There is a small choking hazard, but there's a choking hazard with Cheerios, with goldfish as well. So you've got to be obviously smart and cautious. Some babies prefer the smooth food, so you can blend that food really fine. For example, eggs or chicken. Some prefer it a little bit more crunchy. You've got to figure that out for that kid. But if you can begin to wean them onto eggs, cheese, and the two commonest allergies are to the proteins in dairy, casein and whey protein, and egg protein allergies. But if you introduce both of those very early, at about 4 months of age, the child will not develop allergies. If you introduce it later, child's immune system starts to develop rapidly after about 6 to 8 months of age. So if you delay the introduction of those foods, and the American Academy of Pediatrics has published a lot of data on this, if you delay the introduction of those foods, you're more likely to get an allergic response. But if you introduce them early, the child's immune system sees them as natural, as part of itself, and it doesn't react against them. So the whole caution from 10, 15 years ago, wait before you give your kids strawberries or peanuts or whatever it is. Now, don't give a baby peanuts, but the earlier you introduce allergenic foods, the less likely that baby is to develop an allergy. So the earlier you can give the baby cheese and eggs, even just cream cheese. We blended cream cheese into the eggs, the smooth eggs, to give it some texture. Ideal micronutrients, ideal macronutrients, and you are quietening down the immune system so that that child will have an affinity for it. It'll have an imprinted memory for that food. It'll enjoy it later, and the baby won't have the allergies down the road.
Wow. And if I think back to my days at university, we learned the exact opposite, as you say, 15 years ago or so. You know, we learned that you put those things off, but it makes so much sense within the development of the immune system that would be so. I did want to also just add to your argument about the importance of animal foods for babies rather than the quintessential rice cereal, which we were all told to wean our babies onto. I mean, if I'm not wrong, I think the baby's liver stores of iron run out at 6 months.
Yeah. In fact, almost always it's supplemented. They give the babies ferrin sol or iron because of that problem. And it's not because there's no iron. I mean, however did we exist, 100 years ago? It's because we're feeding them food that is deficient, not only in iron, but other micronutrients.
Yeah. So I mean, that tells us then that we need to be feeding them animal-based food, which is the best source of iron from before 6 months, or at least by 6 months, if that's when the iron stores run out. I think that's very, very, very clear.
Things like iodine for brain development, critically important. If that's where some of the marine products come in, you cannot supplement your way out of real food, because the issue with supplements is nobody truly knows what the correct concentrations are, and often we're overdosing. But secondly, there's a lot of things in supplements that just aren't there. And so it's what's not in there. If you give your baby a protein shake, okay, I'm going to give my baby a toddler formula in this place, it's the amino acids that are not in there that are the problem. And those are usually the essential amino acids. So the best food for a human being is real food.
Yeah.
And that is the challenge. Animal-based, but the vegetables are not the issue. The issue is the way we've hybridized them. So, if you go back into smaller rural areas where they've been using the same seeds over and over, they've grown it in the same soil, they're not fertilizing a lot, the quality of that nutrition of the plants, even though it's not necessarily fully adequate, is at least better than the garbage, the commercially produced garbage that we buy in the stores. It is not natural for a grape not to have seeds. It's not natural for a strawberry to be this big. It's not natural for an apple to be this big. Kale used to be garnish. Now we're making smoothies and blending it in. Those are manufactured foods, even though it might be an apple. It's a manufactured food because the genetics were manufactured in a laboratory. So it's essentially a laboratory-grown food that we're cultivating outside, but it is not a natural product. Now you can say the same about animals, but the hybridization of animals has been much slower in terms of that change.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, we haven't got that much time, and I feel like we've stuck at the before 5-year age. So from conception through to 5 years, which you said in the beginning is the most important, crucial period. And I think our audience is hearing that because Daniel says, "Hi, Dr. Cywes, unfortunately, we can't go back in time. But now that I understand how our children's diet should have been, I'm wondering what can still be done to support and improve brain health in teenagers and even young adults. Is there still hope, or is it too late?"
Oh, no, there's always hope. There's always hope. And it's not just in teenagers. It's until you hear the nails going into the coffin, you have an opportunity to be healthier based on what you're eating at any age. But the teenage years, so the two most rapid periods of growth are the first year of life, and then from around 11 to 12 to 18 years of age, where the growth velocity of that child is enormous. So it's not just about brain health, it's about the entire growth of that child. It defines stature. It defines, for example, a young girl who may have polycystic ovarian syndrome if she's eating a lot of sugar. That destroys the rest of the life of that child if they develop that PCOS. And PCOS, the way I talk about it is your genetics loads the gun and your lifestyle pulls the trigger. So if that young girl is having awful periods, she's having periods for 7 or 8 days, the cycles are horrible, getting rid of the carbohydrates or radically reducing them is going to correct that, because that is a function of hyperinsulinemic insulin resistance. If the child is putting on weight very quickly, that is a massive social liability. You see, the problem with a teenager is they've got a big S on their chest. They wear their underwear on the outside. They're Supergirl or Superman. And it's very difficult to find tangible reasons for them to change from the incredibly wonderful taste of a tub of ice cream. So there has to be incentive to change. and we can leverage some of that incentive. Just, you can't say to them, oh, you'll be healthy when you're 40, or if you smoke now, you're going to have a heart attack when you're 40 or 50. They don't. That's not a rational discussion, because what they're seeking is the immediate gratification. But there's already immediately or early on for some of these kids an opportunity for motivation. So, for example, if a child is playing rugby, a boy is playing rugby, or he wants to build up some bulk, maybe that carnivore or more meat-based diet appeals to them. If the girl has PCOS, or she's an athlete trying to improve herself, there are ways we can find leverage. So that's the first thing. And I don't think you should eliminate carbohydrates from a child's diet, but you want to contain the relationship. You know, if every time I'm thirsty, I drink wine, I'm rapidly going to be an alcoholic. But if I drink a glass of wine every now and then for fun, but I drink water when I'm thirsty, I'm just fine. And exactly the same thing with carbohydrates. If we teach a child what food is, which is animal products and vegetables, and we give them carbohydrates from time to time for pleasure, like I would drink a glass of wine, that is absolutely fine. You're teaching them to be responsible with this. However, one of the ways we can change this is to change the home environment so that they don't have access. Very often, if there's a lot of carbohydrates in the house, the child will automatically, and so does the adult, do what I call drive-bys. So it's not just the act of eating the carbohydrates. If you're snacking all the time, you're not allowing yourself to go into fat utilization mode, which is where all the regulation, the autophagy, the mitochondrial repair, the cancer surveillance, all of those things are happening in that fasting phase. If you're snacking all the time, that becomes a problem as well. So there are tremendous opportunities down the road. The challenge is you have to negotiate with that child rather than forcing them. Because when you tell a child what they must do, an adolescent what they must do, you may have the best advice in the whole wide world. They're going to see it as criticism, put up their shields, and go away. They can still emulate some of your behavior, or you can have a discussion where they lead the narrative, where you say, hey, how do we fix this? How do we correct this? And they come with the answers. If you provide the answers, they see that as criticism. And that's a challenge of raising a teenager. The way I look at handling a teenager, if you want to help them to solve problems, is a bit like going out into the veld or into the bush, and you want to get an antelope or a deer to come and eat from your hands. So you've got some grain or corn in your hands, and you have to be very quiet for a very long time. And then when that deer slowly, or that springbok slowly comes up to you and begins to eat from your hand, the worst thing you can do is reach out and stroke it. That's how teenagers are. You want to be present. You want to be available to them quietly. They may not come and talk to you today, but at some point, they will, with trepidation, come and talk to you about something. And if you then give them advice, you're going to lose them right away. What you want to do is help them to solve their own problems, help them to work through it, and help them to have ownership of their own diet, of their own identity. And it is a very, very challenging thing for us parents to do. But as part of that, having a home where they have access to the foods that we do eat, and maybe when we go out, buy them the ice cream, but don't have the ice cream in the house. Those are ways that you can do that. The final thing to do with most teenagers is if you appeal to them for help. I've got diabetes. I want to lose some weight. Would you help me? You know how difficult it is for me not to eat ice cream. So won't you help me to not have it there? Won't you help me not to eat it? They will still do for you what they won't necessarily do for themselves. So the psychology of raising a teenager is really, really challenging. But ultimately, we have to help them to help themselves, because that's what being a teenager is. But yes, growth velocity is extremely fast in our teenager years. And it either goes in a healthy direction or it goes in a harmful direction that is going to be very, very difficult to correct down the road. Now you're sitting with a 25, 30-year-old mom or woman who wants to have a baby, but she's got PCOS. But they don't think that way.
Well, I think those tips are actually incredibly helpful, because you've given us, my daughter's just turned 13 last week. So you're definitely speaking to someone who's taking notes right here. But I think it makes so much sense, because it's like they're adults in the making by then. And if you think about all the coaching strategies one uses with adults, it is also guiding adults to answer their own questions, to come up with their own solutions. So actually you're starting to introduce techniques that we use in adults into these young adults, and it makes so much sense because it gives them self-efficacy. It also sets them up for success for when they leave the home, I imagine, because I know you speak in some of your other lectures in nutrition network training on the different parenting styles, the authoritarian parenting style, and all those different parenting styles. So I think that also feeds into it. It's the same. It's being a conscious parent. And it feeds in again to what you said right in the beginning about how the mother, even with the baby on her back, going to work in the fields or pick berries or do whatever she was going to do, was modeling behavior, modeling relaxation behavior, modeling communal behavior, modeling physical activity behavior, which I actually wanted to get back to, but I see we've got more questions. So maybe before we get back to all of those psychological things, which I think are very important. And I also wanted to get into the other things in the environment, which I'm sure might be playing a role in these developmental and behavioral things. So I'm hoping we get into that. But before we do, Daniel asks, well, Kieran actually said that he thinks it must be the modeling as an adult is still important as a teenager. And I know you reiterated that. Then Daniel
let me just reinforce something here. The best way to learn is through other people's mistakes. But in order to learn from other people's mistakes, you have to have the confidence to be able to engage with other people. And if you look at our youth currently, that disengagement or engagement through a screen has become their primary source of engagement. And the challenge there is learning the confidence and the comfort of going to people for advice, going to people for guidance. So we have to show our children how to do that so that they don't bump their own heads and then have to correct it down the road. And that social engagement is so important. But in the modern era, we go to work and we leave our kids with somebody else. Our kids go off to school. They're getting taught all their socialization, not through the parents, which sometimes is a good thing, sometimes a bad thing, but it's through others. And I think we need to take that back to the extent we can at various times. It may be early morning before they go to school, when they come home, but we don't do that because we're living our own lives in parallel to them, not in community with them.
Yeah. And I imagine with the screen business as well, I think it's getting, if I'm watching the kids at school, it's getting difficult because a lot of the socializing is turning towards screens. Luckily, I live in a very tiny seaside village where there's less of that. And I see it more in the suburbs or the cities. But there's a lot of socializing that's starting to happen on these devices. And how can we, without, we don't want to say to our kids, you can't go on the screen, you can't socialize with your friends if that's where all the socializing is happening. But at the same time, we want to encourage socializing outside of the screen.
It's a very simple, you've got to step back and understand what they're looking at on the screen. And what you've got to understand is the majority of platforms, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, are marketplaces. They are designed as an online marketplace to sell us stuff. And they engage us. They've got this wonderful formula of engaging us by offering us a little clip, a little video, a communication device. But really, it's a back end to sell product. That's why these things exist. They're not altruistic. They are a commercial entity trying to make money. Now, yes, you're right. Screen time is inevitable. But I think in my lifetime, the greatest advance in screen time is AI. I use AI all the time in my practice. The difference is this. With AI, I'm controlling the narrative. And I'm engaging in conversation with AI where I'm controlling the narrative because it is not a marketplace. It is the repository for facts and factual thinking, but I have to control or manage that thought process and even have arguments. So the beauty about AI, we cannot escape it. We cannot say, don't use AI, don't. But if I can have my child go on AI and control the narrative, they are learning, they're controlling knowledge. Yes, not from me, but from a reliable source. When they go on social media, they're being trapped in a highly addictive marketplace. That's like going shopping. I mean, a lot of people will go shopping and it's, that was the old place where you buy a bunch of crap that you didn't need. Same thing with those social marketplaces. So I really, really like AI. It is a repository of knowledge, but it also, if you use it properly and you teach your child to use it properly, you can learn the argumentative and discussive prompts. So, for example, as someone who works in the field I do, I'm continuously having arguments with Grok and ChatGPT about what the best nutrition is. And yet it is very adaptive. So it will adapt to our argument, to our discussion. And I can have a very meaningful conversation with AI, which is way better than TikTok. Now, the ideal is to have that conversation with one of my patients or with a colleague and maybe verify the facts on AI, which is another use for it. But I think AI will be the revolution. And if we can triage our kids away from social media toward AI, that's the best thing to do. And then AI will tell you, go and have a discussion with another human being. So we talk face to face rather than through TikTok or Snapchat or whatever it is.
I really love that. Dr. Cywes, I think just to kind of end off the question about can we undo any damage that's done early in life? I feel like I totally hear what you say about the fact that we can prevent any further damage because of the swift growth that happens in those teenage years, and we can prevent maybe metabolic diseases later in life, and we can promote health later in life. But what about any damage that was done pre 5 years? Is there any way we can reverse that after 5 years? Or not,
I think,
in your opinion?
The first of all, human beings are we've got so many built-in mechanisms for flexibility, for recovery. That's what makes us a successful species. Is long-term as a society, we're adaptable. We will bump our heads, but we'll find the solution. That's what makes us human. So, at a societal level, certainly with taking politics out of this, here in the US, we're starting to see a major centralized policy shift back to a healthier way of eating. The Surgeon General is Casey Means, who's one of us. She's a ketogenic person, and she was apolitical. She was hired into that. A lot of the folks changing policy at a macro societal level, we're going to see a rapid shift back to healthier, more physiologically driven nutrition rather than an industry-shaped nutrition policy. As an individual, when you have certain diseases, some of them are reversible, but some of them are what they are. For example, the autistic structural brain element is not reversible. However, we have to use what we use. Even though the telephone wire may be damaged, if we can optimize it, we may be able to get it to work somewhat. And I think part of the problem with a lot of, we're talking about autism, which is the primary structural or spectrum disorders, the whole structural problem with the brain, you're not going to fix that structure. But when you eat a lot of sugar and starch, there's also a behavioral element, the ADHD, the ADD element. And if you can eliminate that and get that child to be calm and slowly process things, then even though their brain capacity may be somewhat, at least it's not the gray matter. The gray matter is usually good. It's the white matter. So that they can then use most effectively the rudimentary connections they have rather than just blowing it all up. So there is absolutely an advantage to a diet that calms people down, that gives them and a psychological strategy that gives them the capacity to process thought within their own level of an anatomical capability. Nobody's brain is perfect. We're all on the spectrum. It's just there's a arbitrary threshold that has become diagnostic now. But the goal with our children is to optimize their genetic potential structurally. But when that hasn't happened, we have to work with that person to optimize what they do have rather than wish they didn't have it. Let's work on using and optimizing what they do have and give them the skills, give them the ability to calm down, to dissipate the emotional upheaval so that they can focus on the facts of the issue. And a large part of that is habituation. It is repetitive healing. It is creating routines, habits, and rituals that you can depend on at a foundational level to your life. So often now, life is reactive. We eat when we can, we eat when we're hungry, we do this, we do that, we sleep when we can, and we are triggered by instant gratification stimuli all the time that distract us from the routine of our lives. And if we can get back to a fundamental small routine on a daily basis, we are the most functional we can be. You know, a guy, whatever you think of him, Elon Musk will tell you, and he has been diagnosed with the spectral issues, still a brilliant person, but he will tell you that he is most brilliant when he's quietly alone. That's where his brilliance comes from. And so seldom do we give ourselves that time to think, that time to be, that time to be calm, and that time to be as free of emotional override that contaminates our ability to think, irrespective of our structural foundation.
I love that. And I think it goes back and speaks to the kind of modern environment and communities that we're living in. You know, when you painted that picture in the beginning of the tribe and, you know, the baby on your back, I think that's the picture that we've moved so incredibly far away from. And it goes hand in hand with all these problems that you've mentioned, from reactivity, lack of sleep, poor diet, lack of alone time, lack of calm time, lack of strategies for relaxation, meditation, all these things that you've been speaking about. So that makes a lot of sense. Daniel asks about, what about the use of supplementation in children or in teenagers, for example, creatine for building muscle mass and strength, and potentially even for its cognitive benefits? Most of the research that he has come across focuses on adults and even the elderly. What is your view on the use of creatine or other supplements to support brain health in teenage and children?
Right. And that's a very important question, because so often in the modern era, we offer quick fix solutions to take something. Even when you're looking at blood work, most doctors look at blood work to say, oh, this number's off, here's a pill for you. Whether it is your B12 levels low, do this, or the foundation for me is always to look at what you are desiring, to look at what you need, and begin foundationally at creating the ideal optimal diet as your source of supplements. So, for example, I was just in South Africa, and I was talking to the under 20, actually the under 19 now, they're going to be the under 20s next year, Springbok rugby team. They were having a game and playing, and I was talking to some of the kids over there, and I got exactly the same question. I said, look, you can't be taking creatine and eating, a Big Mac and fries and ice cream. It doesn't work that way. Optimize your diet, get what you need from your meat. I don't see, so when we talk about supplements, we're talking about micronutrients and things that augment deficits. But taking more of something that you already have plenty of is not going to make you super better. Everything is on a bell curve. So, for example, my friend Ken Berg and I have this discussion all the time about vitamin D3. D3K2 is a very important, very often undersupplied supplement, one of the commonest supplements my patients take, but it is on a bell curve. More is not always better, and I see people way overdosing. So specifically something like creatine, I really, really like creatine as a supplement on top of a healthy, heavily meat-based diet. Most of the time you don't need it. However, the rule about creatine or supplemental testosterone when you're older, not as a child, exercise. So no, don't take creatine and hope you're going to build muscle. Take creatine because you are working out. And creatine is no different than having a sugar gel or having a steak or whatever it is. It's a form of food that provides energy and substrate for your muscle. So I like creatine at 5 to 10 grams, but only on days when you're exercising. But don't use it because you want to build muscle. Start by optimizing your diet, optimizing the pattern of eating, which is the pattern of eating is as important when it comes to bulking up to muscle as is what you're eating. And then if you need something extra, those are fine. But remember, a lot of the protein shakes and things like that, your liver is just going to turn that to sugar. It's not going to, oh, I'm drinking a protein shake, my muscle. No, it's not. All it is a sugar shake through gluconeogenesis, the liver is going to turn that to sugar. The best protein supplement, the best protein shake for me is milk. And the old days, that's what we used to use. Again, the old days are not necessarily the better days, but certainly that plus a little shot of testosterone, if you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, was the way you become Mr. Olympia. It was a little tongue-in-cheek. But I think the key thing is look at what you're eating and drinking and then potentially supplement off that. I'll just to share this with you, I am not a supplement person. There are 3 things that we take. I've got a strong family history of Alzheimer's, so I do take fish oil. And even my 4-year-old son gets a little bit of fish oil. We all get a small amount of iodine because the salt that we use is not iodized. And iodine is not only important for the thyroid, it's important for the brain. And then through the winter, we use some D3K2. That's it. I don't use those other supplements. Now, would I use creatine if I was a bodybuilder? I would consider it, absolutely. But only on top of what I was already eating, not as an alternative.
Thank you, Dr. Cywes. We're at the 1 hour mark, but so I would like you to maybe just as a closing statement, because we didn't cover this at all, but I think it's important for people to be aware that it's out there beyond nutrition, beyond screens, and as you mentioned, the chess kind of strategy of learned behaviors. Is there anything else, or lack of, or presence of anything else within the environment that you feel is negatively or positively contributing, or probably negatively contributing to behavioral and neurodevelopmental problems within our youth?
Very good question. And there's a myriad of them. But the one thing that I see that is it's the easiest fix, and yet it's the greatest deficit. Go outside. Go outside. Go outside. Your eyes are going to benefit from seeing infinity. Most of our eyes are built around 5 or 6 meters of visual length. Our skin, our brain, our body is going to be liberated just by going outside. And whether it's winter, summer, spring or autumn, you can go outside. And that's just because when you're outside, you're probably going to do something physically active. You're probably going to have relaxing experiences, whether you're urban, whether you're rural, it doesn't matter. Go outside. Look also then at how much time you spend inside. And if you look at that fractional ratio, that is a very, very simple fix. And if you go outside without your phone, without a screen, it's even better. Take a friend, even better. So you can build on that. And that's just the simple answer.
I love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Cywes. I could talk to you forever. And I know our listeners, we had so many people tuning in, and we'll have even more people watching this after the fact. And we had some lovely comments, and they all really, really loved everything that you had to say. So thank you so much, so much for joining us on this Youth Day. You've really illuminated how critical nutrition is to brain development from the earliest stages of life all the way through adolescence, how important what we feed our kids is, but also how important all these other things are, from outside to lack of screen time to, social, to in utero stuff, to what mothers do in the first 5 years, to how you raise your children, to how you connect with your children, and so much more. So thank you for all those tidbits. I wish we had time to dive into each of them in so much detail, because I really wanted to, and I think there's so much more to learn. But if any of you do want to dive into some of this in a bit more detail, Dr. Cywes does cover this topic both in our Nutrition Network's ketogenic training and in Nutrition Network's Metabolism in the Mind training, and in the ketogenic textbook. Dr. Cywes actually contributes multiple other lectures to various other trainings as well, including ones on liver, which I know is one of your pet topics and also was the topic of your PhD. And many other trainings. So please dive into those trainings, learn more from Dr. Cywes, our Carb Addiction Doc. We are always just so thankful for your contributions and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr.
Thanks
Cywes.
very much. And thank you so much for what you guys do. I mean, it really is, from a tiny little country at the bottom of Africa, this international explosion. It's absolutely wonderful. Just 2 comments. I am CarbAddictionDoc across social media, and our YouTube channel has a lot of informational stuff, often crosses over with the Nutrition Network. And if anybody, I am a clinically practicing physician. I'm worldwide. WhatsApp +1 561 517 0642. We do consults throughout the world. I've got a large population of patients in South Africa, Australia, the Far East. So if somebody's looking for a second opinion or looking for a different read on their biology, not just the psychology, but on their metabolic biology, that's what we do, and be happy to consult.
And there'd be no one better to get that advice from than you, Dr. Cywes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience. Thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging. And please, all of you, just stay curious, stay healthy, and let's continue to challenge the status quo for the health of our youth today on International Youth Day. Over and out, and we will chat to you again next week. Thank you. Bye.